Hello, Ted Morrissey here for my course in classic sci-fi and horror by women writers in the Lindenwood University MFA in Writing program. And I just want to do, I think, a pretty brief video, which maybe a relief for some of us. I want to kind of focus on an idea I gleaned from the past week's readings, in which we looked at The Shadowy Third by Ellen Glasgow, which was published in 1916 for the first time in Scribner's Magazine. And we also looked at Marjorie Bowen's Scoured Silk, which appeared in All Story Weekly in 1918. And in particular, I want to look at something in, Scoured Silk, I believe. Nope, take that back. In The Shadowy Third, which is just a kind of a small detail, but it really got me thinking about some possibilities for our own writing, which obviously is kind of our chief focus here. As you know, even though the course is titled Classic Sci-Fi and Horror, or Horror and Sci-Fi, as the case may be, we definitely tend more way towards the horror side. We've talked about that a little bit. Part of the reason the course doesn't seem to be as sci-fi oriented as it is horror oriented is because sci-fi, as we think of it, really didn't develop until after World War II. Obviously, we can look back and we can find examples of writers and stories from previous time periods that as we look back at them, we recognize them as science fiction. But science fiction, as we think of it, in terms of the kind of speculative science fiction we're used to, and space opera and cyberpunk and all that sort of thing, that really didn't develop until after, like I said, World War II, kind of the 1950s in particular, is where a lot of that sort of got its traction and took off, became really popular. The term science fiction itself didn't really start to be used in the context we even think of it as until the 1920s. And of course, this anthology goes from the early 1800s to about 1930 or so. So it just barely creeps into the time period where science fiction as a recognizable term was starting to be used. And it'll be another generation or so before the types of science fiction stories and novels and movies and so on develop that we tend to think of when we think of science fiction. Right? Nevertheless, I think we can glean some ideas for sci-fi slash horror. We have talked about the fact that there's this, if you look at sci-fi and horror and kind of a Venn diagram type of thing, there's a big chunk in the middle of stuff that is both sci-fi and horror. Science fiction lends itself to the horrific in many ways, right? But this was a section of a Glasgow story that got me thinking. And this is from page 216 of our anthology, The Cold Embrace, if you want to take a look on your own. But it says, this is, kind of towards the endish of the story. It says, it was all perfectly true. I suppose it sounded as plausible as a story out of a newspaper, and yet while she told me I felt, or dreamed that I felt, a sinister and impalpable hush in the air, I was nervous, no doubt. I was shaken by the suddenness with which the housekeeper had sprung her news on me of the forthcoming marriage, as you remember. But as I sat there, this is the part I want to zero in on. As I sat there, I had quite vividly an impression that the old house was listening, that there was a real, if invisible, presence somewhere in the room or the garden. Now, obviously, at the time that Glasgow wrote this story, she was referencing the supernatural, the sense almost of a haunted house, which, of course, we've talked about throughout the session, particularly the sort of classic Gothic haunted house environment. But that particular line about a real, if invisible, presence somewhere in the room got me thinking about our modern lives that we're living in. Many of us, if not most of us, are living in homes where we have devices listening to us and reacting to us all the time. We have an Echo device, Alexa, that we use on a regular basis, but she's always listening, right? And we've just sort of gotten used to the fact that our house has this entity which is paying attention to us all the time, right? So as we mention different things that we're interested in, different products we're thinking about buying, different maybe series we're thinking about watching, it's taking all that data in, and then therefore then it's feeding back to us things that it thinks we may be interested in. Right, our cell phones are listening to us. We've long since gotten used to the idea that if we mention out loud that we're interested in, I don't know, a new computer or something, then we suddenly start getting ads for new computers, right, on our Facebook feeds, in our Google alerts, whatever it might be, right? Um, the other day, it was kind of spooky. My wife and I were in my car, and I was listening to Spotify through the phone. I had plugged into the car's USB port, that whole thing. Very high tech of me. Anyway, we were talking, and I can't even remember quite sure about what, but we were talking about that maybe we'd be interested in buying something. We were kind of in running some errands, and we'd kind of floated the idea of buying something. Well, instantly, the Spotify ad that popped up was about that exact kind of product. I mean, it was like 5 seconds later. Maybe coincidence, but I don't think so. I think probably our conversation was being eavesdropped on, and the algorithm sent us information to try to get us to buy a particular product and so forth. So that got me thinking about our houses and our devices listening to us. Obviously, there have been writers who have looked into this kind of idea, the idea of smart houses and that kind of thing. But I think it's a really underdeveloped area for creative writing, particularly if you want to try to attach a sort of horror, motif to those kinds of stories. So, I mentioned that I've been working on a brand new thing and just really kind of trying to get my bearings with this sort of dystopian kind of world that I'm starting to sort of figure out in my head. And one of the elements that I'm definitely playing with is this idea of our being okay with being kind of constantly monitored and having our intentions, our whims, our desires constantly being, recorded and reacted to in some way or another. And so again, I'm kind of playing with that in the brand new fiction that I'm starting to work on just the last couple of months, right? So anyway, I wanted to throw that out there. This idea of constant surveillance, particularly maybe in our homes and in our cars and with our devices, listening to us and reacting to us, and maybe even the idea that we seem to be okay with that. I know there are people who aren't. There are people who are very much off the grid or try to be as much as possible, and I suspect it's hard to be off the grid completely. But there are people who make a conscientious effort to be, not being monitored by their electronics and that kind of thing. I work at the local library, have for 23 years, and we have quite a few people who come in regularly who use our computers whenever they need to check their email or whatever it might be, because they don't have computers at home, and they don't want them. They don't want that kind of device in their home. They don't want Wi-Fi. They don't want an Alexa, kind of device listening to them. They recognize that having access to the internet is from time to time a good thing, but they have access through the library, so they don't want to kind of bring that into their own kind of living space. And I get that. I really do. And they have to make sure they're using the internet and our computers when we're open. So there's no 1 a.m. Amazon surfing or that kind of thing. But still, they are very cognizant of being, watched and listened to, and are trying to avoid that. So anyway, just want to throw all that out there. I'd be curious what you think in terms of potential narrative based on this idea of smart homes, smart devices listening to us, maybe manipulating us in various kinds of ways. Maybe you have already kind of written that sort of thing, or been thinking about writing that sort of thing, and maybe you have some examples of some stories like that. I had a few kind of come to mind. I was thinking of Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey, in which you have Hal, the computer, which is sort of in the spaceship, that kind of runs the spaceship kind of automatically. But they interact with Hal, and I assume most people are familiar with that movie since it came out in the 60s, 1968. At one point, the astronauts on board that ship are concerned that Hal is acting a little funny. It's maybe having something of a nervous breakdown. So they go to a part of the ship that where they think Hal can't hear them. And they have this conversation about Hal behind his back, so to speak. But lo and behold, Hal can see them, and the computer reads lips, so they're in trouble, right? Um, I can think of a few other examples where writers have brought into the idea of a smart house. I think of a Ray Bradbury story, early Ray Bradbury story, I think from the 50s, maybe 1950s. I want to say There Will Come April Rains or something like that. I should have looked up the title exactly, but it's a very brief story, but the idea is that it's futuristic, and Bradbury, who was very good at imagining what the future is going to be like, he imagined the smart home. He anticipated the smart home, half a century before it was actually a doable kind of thing. And so in the story, there's been some sort of a disaster. I don't think we quite know what. And the family that lives in this home is gone, just completely gone. But yet the home doesn't seem to know that. So it continues its daily routine of the alarm going off, making breakfast, serving breakfast, cleaning up, the uneaten breakfast, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's just a very haunting sort of feeling to it because the computer in the house is going through its daily routines, thinking that there are human beings there who are going to respond to the things that it's doing, and they aren't. Right, so it really underscores their absence, right? So anyway, you probably know of some stories that have a similar kind of element, so I'd be interested to hear about that as well. All right, I'm going to stop there, and I will see you down the digital trail.